How is Finland after 2 years of joining NATO? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Join me today. Finland's entry into NATO represents one of Europe's most dramatic strategic reversals in the post-war era. For decades, the country cultivated a carefully balanced position between East and West, an approach defined not by passivity but by a sophisticated understanding of its geography, its history, and the limits of great power politics. Finnish neutrality was never ideological. It was a pragmatic doctrine rooted in the recognition that long-term stability in Northern Europe required coexistence rather than confrontation. That equilibrium collapsed after the outbreak of the Ukraine war, when fear and uncertainty reshaped public sentiment and political discourse across the continent. Helsinki's leadership increasingly adopted the view that security could no longer be guaranteed through distance or diplomacy. Instead, the country must anchor itself within the Western military alliance. The shift was swift, emotionally charged, and framed as an existential necessity, a response to what many saw as a new era of unpredictability emanating from Russia. Yet such profound decisions rarely come without structural consequences. Finland moved from a posture of strategic insulation to one of direct exposure. By joining NATO, it effectively repositioned itself from a buffer state capable of mediating tensions to a forward operating frontier of the alliance's northern flank. This transformation changes not only Finland's defensive obligations, but also its economic vulnerabilities, diplomatic space, and long-term development trajectory. I would argue that the deeper issue lies in the speed and psychology of the decision. Choices shaped in a climate of crisis can obscure the broader calculus of national interest. Finland's pivot was driven by legitimate security concerns. Still, the aftermath reveals how abrupt geopolitical realignment can generate unintended pressures, new border dynamics, economic shocks, and diminished room for independent foreign policy. Finland entered NATO with the conviction that security demanded boldness. Yet, within months, the country found itself confronting a very different kind of threat, one not from Moscow's tanks, but from the unraveling of its own economic architecture. What was framed as a strategic triumph suddenly exposed a deep fragility. Finland had underestimated how profoundly its prosperity depended on a delicate web of cross-border exchanges. The break with Russia was not a symbolic gesture. It was a rupture of an economic ecosystem built over generations. Once the border hardened, entire regions lost their lifeline overnight. Small towns that had thrived on constant flows of visitors, trade, and logistical activity suddenly faced empty streets, shuttered businesses, and collapsing local budgets. Industries that had long relied on predictable supply chains, forestry, machinery, energy-intensive manufacturing were thrust into chaos as raw materials became scarce and replacements far more expensive. The air transport sector, once Finland's crown jewel, suffered a blow reminiscent of the global oil shocks of the 1970 seconds. With Russian airspace closed, Finland's strategic position as Europe's gateway to Asia evaporated instantly. Routes grew longer, costs soared, and the competitive advantage that had taken decades to build dissolved. The country's flagship airline went from national pride to existential uncertainty in a matter of months. These disruptions collided with broader macroeconomic vulnerabilities, a shrinking tax base, rising unemployment, and the spiraling costs of imported materials created a fiscal squeeze unheard of in Finland's modern history. The Nordic welfare state, long celebrated as resilient and generous, suddenly appeared brittle. For the first time in decades, policymakers faced the prospect of cutting social benefits while simultaneously increasing defense spending to meet alliance commitments. It was a collision of priorities that no amount of political rhetoric could gloss over. The deeper issue, however, is structural. Finland stepped into NATO with a security blueprint, but without an economic exit plan from its old model of interdependence. The assumption that Western markets could instantly absorb the shock was not merely optimistic, it was strategically careless. Geography does not bend to alliances. Finland's economy was built around its position as a bridge. By choosing to become a wall, it must now bear the economic weight of that transformation. In truth, Finland's most significant challenge today is not military risk, but the silent, grinding pressure of an economic realignment for which it was never fully prepared. Finland's NATO membership undeniably strengthens the alliance's northern posture, yet beneath the celebratory rhetoric lies a harsher strategic reality. In reinforcing NATO, Finland may have simultaneously undermined its own long-term security architecture. The shift from neutrality to frontline status has not simply altered Finland's strategic map, it has rewritten its entire vulnerability profile. For decades, Finland's security rested on a doctrine of calibrated distance, armed neutrality backed by a robust domestic defense system. The country maintained one of Europe's most significant reserve forces, advanced artillery, and a high readiness mobilization structure, precisely because it understood its proximity to Russia could never be offset by external guarantees alone. That model offered something rare in contemporary Europe: predictability. Both Helsinki and Moscow operated within a known equilibrium. NATO membership shattered that equilibrium. Instead of serving as a buffer between two security spheres, Finland now sits squarely inside one and directly across from the other. The 300-kilometer Finnish-Russian border, once managed through a blend of caution and cooperation, has become the alliance's most extensive land frontier with Russia. Strategically, this transforms Finland into a potential corridor or flashpoint in any escalation scenario, an outcome the old neutrality model was explicitly designed to avoid. From Moscow's perspective, Finland's accession forces a recalculation, not necessarily a desire for confrontation, but a reconfiguration of force posture, energy routes, and northern military planning. The Arctic, long governed by a fragile balance between cooperation and competition, now becomes an arena where Finland's alignment deepens NATO's presence and compresses Russia's strategic depth. This shift heightens tensions in a region previously characterized more by diplomacy than militarization. Even within NATO, Finland's new role is not without friction. The alliance gains territory and infrastructure, but Finland absorbs the operational risk. Its geography makes it the first to feel pressure in any crisis, while larger powers retain strategic distance. This asymmetry, amplified by Finland's obligation to meet high defense spending targets, could reshape domestic politics as citizens question whether the benefits justify the exposure. A Sachs-style analysis highlights a more profound paradox. By prioritizing symbolic security, Finland may have compromised the very foundations of its practical security. Deterrence has increased on paper, but strategic predictability has weakened. In international affairs, unpredictability, not power, is often the true risk multiplier. Finland has entered an alliance strengthened by its membership, but in doing so, it has stepped onto a geopolitical fault line where stability depends not on military strength alone, but on the fragile management of a new, uncertain frontier. Finland's geopolitical turn has not only reshaped its external environment, it is now reshaping the fabric of its domestic society. The nation long celebrated as the epitome of social cohesion and welfare stability is facing pressures unfamiliar in its modern history. What once appeared to be an unbreakable Nordic equilibrium is beginning to show its first visible fractures. The Finnish welfare model depends on a delicate balance of high employment, steady growth, and predictable state revenue. But as economic headwinds intensify and security expenditures rise, that balance is no longer assured. The government faces a mounting contradiction: sustain the military buildup demanded by its new alliance commitments, or preserve the social benefits that have defined Finland's identity for decades. Trying to do both strains the system in ways that no political narrative can fully conceal. Communities near the eastern border feel the pressure first and most acutely. These regions lost their economic anchors, and with them, the social confidence that kept local politics stable. Rising unemployment, declining public services, and the erosion of once thriving municipal economies create a slow-burning frustration. These are not abstract macroeconomic indicators. They manifest in everyday life in shuttered storefronts, reduced school budgets, empty hotels, and the hum of a regional economy that no longer has a pulse. As household insecurity grows, political polarization follows. Finland's traditionally centrist political culture, built on compromise, consensus, and trust, is beginning to tilt. Questions that once seemed unthinkable are being openly debated. Has the country overcommitted to NATO? Are rising defense obligations compatible with the Nordic welfare state? And most fundamentally, has Finland sacrificed long-term social stability for short-term geopolitical reassurance within government? The divide is also widening. Economic ministries warn of unsustainable fiscal paths, while defense officials emphasize the need for rapid military modernization. These institutional tensions create a governance challenge. The state must reconcile two competing imperatives within limited economic bandwidth. The deeper issue mirrors a pattern seen elsewhere in Europe. When security strategy outruns social capacity, the state's legitimacy is tested. Finland now risks entering a phase in which frustration becomes political capital for actors promising alternative paths, some more pragmatic, others more radical. I would describe this as the emerging internal cost of external alignment. The country strengthened its strategic ties abroad, but at home, the social consensus that underpinned Finland's stability is becoming increasingly fragile. Stability, once Finland's greatest asset, is now the very thing it must fight to preserve. Finland now stands at a decisive crossroads. Its historic shift into NATO was framed as a protective leap into the future. Yet, the consequences reveal a far more complex landscape, one in which security, economics, and societal cohesion are intertwined, and none can be insulated from the others. The strategic question Finland faces is no longer whether joining NATO brings safety. It is whether the nation can withstand the full spectrum of pressures that choice entails. The central paradox is stark. Finland now enjoys a stronger security umbrella but faces a weaker strategic position. Its border has become one of NATO's most sensitive fault lines. Its economy is absorbing the shock of abruptly severed interdependence, and its political system is being pulled between rising defense obligations and a social model that depends on fiscal stability. These tensions cannot simply be managed with rhetoric or alliance symbolism. They require long-term recalibration grounded in realism rather than fear. For Finland to regain strategic balance, it must confront the structural mismatch created by its rapid realignment. That means developing an economic strategy capable of replacing lost markets, restoring regional stability, and protecting the integrity of the welfare state. It also demands a diplomatic approach that avoids turning the northern frontier into a permanent zone of geopolitical tension. Jeffrey Sachs would frame the issue bluntly. Nations do not secure themselves by joining alliances alone. They secure themselves by maintaining sustainable economic foundations, predictable relations with neighbors, and political systems resilient enough to absorb external shocks. Finland's story is not a cautionary tale. It is a test case. It will show whether a small, highly developed nation can navigate the demands of a polarized global order without losing the equilibrium that once defined its strength. The coming years will reveal whether Finland has stepped into a safer future or into a prolonged cycle of strategic vulnerability. Thank you for watching.